Welcome, everyone, to an introduction to Dedoose, an online mixed methods analysis software that is useful for interdisciplinary and collaborative projects, including working with students. Today's session will be presented by Dr. Jaime Hartless and Dr. Natalie Ingraham of Anthropology and Sociology. So with that, I'm going to turn it right over to our presenters and we'll get started.
I'll start with the agenda. There we go. So we're going to talk about briefly touch on like what qualitative methods are in case folks are unfamiliar, although I assume most people viewing this are familiar, but just to recap, I think to guide why Dedoose is particularly useful for qualitative methods. We'll talk about what Dedoose is, some of its basics, some of the pros and cons. We'll give some screenshots from our own projects and do a little preview of the spring session where we're going to do a more hands-on Dedoose training. And then we'll have time for Q&A if we have any questions. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Jaime.
Well, hi, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about what kind of data Dedoose is actually very useful for analyzing, and that is specifically qualitative data. And I know from being a member of the IRB that many people at Farmingdale use a lot of quantitative measures such as survey design, but maybe you're interested in dipping your toe into more qualitative options. So the biggest difference between quantitative and qualitative data is quantitative data is all about measuring the impact of one independent variable on a dependent variable and measuring the magnitude of the relationship between two variables. But maybe that rather than knowing how much of an impact X has on Y, you want to know instead, what is the relationship between X and Y? How do X and Y relate to one another? What's the process through which X connects to Y? And you instead want to look at the meaning and context of a phenomenon, which is much less mathematical and much more intuitive. So qualitative methods are methods that help us understand how and why things happen. So some examples of some qualitative methods you may have encountered in your research would be open-ended interviews, ethnographies where you observe real-world social interactions in real time, content analyses of things like news articles, or media analysis of films and books. So once qualitative data is collected, you still want to rigorously interpret that data and identify some of its central themes and concepts. So how do you actually do that? Well, in our increasingly digital age, we're increasingly turning to software to do a lot of that coding and analysis. So we're going to be talking about one of those software packages today, Dedoose.
All right, so at its core, Dedoose is a web-based cross-platform app for analyzing qualitative, but also some mixed methods research as well. So Dedoose can analyze a lot of different types of data, including text, photos, audio, video, even spreadsheet data and more. So it can do quite a bit. Dedoose is obviously not the only qualitative software out there. This slide is from George Mason University. One of their librarians there put together a really great presentation on different kinds of qualitative softwares. So I've used several here. I've used Atlas, I've used MaxQEA, I've used NVivo, but I've been using Dedoose since graduate school because I am always been doing collaborative research. And a lot of these do very similar jobs in terms of coding, but I do think Dedoose has an advantage in terms of its ability because it's web and cloud-based. It's really great for collaboration. So let's talk a little bit more about what Dedoose does.
So in terms of what Dedoose actually is, it's very similar to most of the other qualitative softwares that Natalie was just describing in terms of how it documents, in terms of how it structures samples and has options for demo projects. One of the things about Dedoose that's great is it's a free trial. So if you're not sure you want to use Dedoose, you don't have to always buy in immediately. You can test it out for yourself to see if it's exactly what you're looking for. It also works on multiple different computer interfaces. So it works on both Mac and Windows, in other words, and it works equally well, I've heard, on both of those devices. I've worked actually on it on both of them and haven't noticed meaningful differences between the two. And you're also able to download a copy of Dedoose that doesn't need to be installed on a hard drive, which means you can work on it in your home computer, your office computer, without having to carry them back and forth and such. And one of the greatest things, particularly for Farmingdale faculty, many of whom do a lot of research with students, like maybe you're involved with the RAM program, or you have student interns that are helping you on your research, it's actually really good, as Natalie was saying earlier, for collaborative labor. So I worked on it, for example, when I was in grad school with my advisor at the time, and we were able to both access the same data at the same time in completely different geographical physical locations, which is not always the case with some other of these software platforms. And from an IRB standpoint and an ethics standpoint, if you're dealing with particularly sensitive data or data that you're worried about getting out, it is stored on the cloud, but it is password protected, and it does have an option for encryption. The one thing they do caution you about with that, though, is that the encryption password, if you lose it, they won't have it. So it's very important to store that for yourself if you do use their encryption feature, but that is an option for protecting sensitive data. And there's also a lot of tools that Dedoose has, and we're going to go over some of them in our spring workshop so you can kind of see them in action. But it has a lot of different features. It has options for adding and analyzing memos. So a big part of qualitative research often is not just coding your data, but reflecting on your codes in your data. And I'll show you momentarily what that looks like in Dedoose. It does not have some features that you might like, particularly if you're interested in doing advanced forms of analysis like mind mapping, drawing, or network analysis, but it does have some mixed methods capabilities. So you can add descriptors such as gender or race to your data, for example, in interviews, and then see how your respondents look different on different codes. And it also has options for code weighting, and also has options if you're using multiple coders to test the reliability of their cross-coding. But it's really great for generating interactive charts, tables, plots, which can really help you see and visualize your data. And it does not have AI features like some other softwares do, that do some automatic analysis, but also doesn't share any of that data to open AI models.
Yeah, so I just want to know here in that presentation prepared by the other librarian, they noted like some like In Vivo and Atlas and others have started to add in AI features where it'll kind of suggest themes to you. As a qualitative researcher, I have some challenges with this because I feel like the researchers should be generating the themes. But I also appreciated that Dedoose explicitly does not share its data with OpenAI. And that was important to me as a person who researches vulnerable populations. I absolutely do not want my data, even though it's anonymized by the time I put it in Dedoose, I definitely don't want it shared with AI modeling. So that feature was particularly important to me as somebody who studies vulnerable populations and has, vulnerable population data in my Dedoose account.
So what we're going to show you now are a couple of screenshots of what Dedoose actually looks like to give you a sense of what it feels like to navigate it using our own data. This is from mine specifically. So one of the great things about Dedoose is you can manage multiple projects at the same time. And sometimes if you're like me and you're a grad student that's learning how things work, you can reanalyze your data or recode or copy it or join in on projects by your advisor. And it stores that for ever perpetually. And if you ever stop paying, this is an anxiety I'm sure for some people, if you ever stop paying, it does still keep your data. It does not delete it. You just won't be able to access it until you repay for it again. More on that a little bit later. And so once you click on a project, it takes you to this page. And I use this one because this is one of my older projects, which was about the presence of straight people in gay bars. I use it because it's one of my most developed interfaces. You can really see all the features that Dedoose provides on it. As you can see on the upper bit of the page, you can navigate around from the home page, which is where we currently are, to a page for codes, media that you can manually upload, descriptors, analysis, and various other pages. But here you can see all of your media. You can click on it directly there to begin coding on it. You can see descriptors and play with them in that box up there and see some charts and every code that you've constructed as well. And so when you upload media, this is what it looks like. And here's some examples of different kinds of media you can upload. It's actually gotten a lot better about this since I started using it, and there's more options now. You can import spreadsheets, you can create your own blank document, import text such as Word documents, PDF files, images, YouTube videos, audio recordings, whole projects. There's a variety of import features.
I just want to note, there is a slight caution if you have video or audio that you're wanting to upload and analyze. It allows a certain amount of that, but if you have a very large project with a lot of that data, it's something to consider. They do charge extra for, over a certain amount of data. So if you have, 100 videos that you're bringing in, think about that in your weighing of pros and cons of different softwares.
Yeah, and here's what it looks like just quickly when you upload your media. It will all be stored in this central media file individually with each one you upload. If you've added any descriptors, they'll be linked to the media. You can also see them, like if you've coded them by, say, race, you can see that that's there. Sex or gender, if you've coded it that way, you can see all of those things in one place.
Yeah, and then really briefly, I didn't have a slide about the descriptors, but maybe that's what you're going to cover next in the next screenshot. I'll make sure I'm not like overlapping with you, but.
Well, I was going to talk about the code book first.
Great.
So also, oftentimes if you're a qualitative researcher, particularly if you already have a clear idea of what codes that you want to use, you might want to go ahead and create the code book. And you can also work on this code book if you're doing preliminary coding and building the codes as you go along. As you can see here in the code section, you can also develop child codes. So if you want to have a theme, like if I want to talk about attitudes towards the UT-LGBTQ community, maybe there's a couple of different attitudes, like, oh, it's bad, or it's anti-sexuality, or it's just not large enough. What is the size of the community? And you can even go smaller into sub-child codes if there's variations of that. So it's really good for brainstorming and developing themes as you go through your data.
Yeah, and I just want to briefly talk about descriptors, which is that, so descriptors you can attach to any of the media pieces. So in this case, the example that Jamie's showing, she has interviews, right? So for each interview, I imagine she's attaching descriptors in this case for the demographics of the person she's interviewing. So, interview 22 has a descriptor for the person's probably sex, their race, and whatever else is relevant. So for example, in one of my other projects, I had descriptors for somebody's gender, their country, because it was an international sample, and then the project was about a chronic illness, so I had a staging for how advanced their chronic illness was. And the descriptors allow you to use a lot of the mixed methods analysis components in terms of seeing like, okay, I just want to see all the female participants in my sample and what codes are coming up most commonly for them. Or I want to see the people with the most advanced version of the disease in my case, right? So descriptors are where a lot of that mixed methods piece comes in terms of tagging your media with the descriptors.
And as you can see, the code and the descriptors are at the bottom of your code sheet as well. And I think there actually is a slide on descriptors, but
okay,
we can.
I was like, I couldn't remember. I was getting
I think there is.
All right. The next couple slides are about some logistics around Dedoose. So what is it like to use it? So Dedoose pricing is a little bit different from other things like in vivo or MaxQDA, in that those tend to be a more traditional kind of software purchase where you pay a one-time or an annual fee and a flat fee, and that's what you pay, which is what purchasing departments are much more used to. So Dedoose has a more flexible pricing structure that varies based on who you are, if you're a student versus faculty or non-student essentially, and the number of people who are going to be accessing your projects. So if you are an individual faculty member, say, the price is $17.95 per month. If you are working with research assistants, you can see there's small group and large group prices that are less money per month, but that's per person. So let's say you had one research assistant, you're going to be paying around $32 a month for the two of you to be using it. So the budgeting there can get slightly more complicated if you're trying to factor in you plus other potential collaborators or research assistants. So there's that. the plus side is it only charges you when you actively access your account or the data. So if you spend 3 months analyzing data set and then you don't touch your account for another 3 months, it doesn't charge you for those 3 months that you didn't access the account at all. So unlike a regular software, if you have like ebb and flow, let's say like a teaching school, we research a lot in the summer. So you spend those 3 summer months using it a lot. And then the 3 months of fall semester being very busy with teaching and don't touch it, you're not being charged for those 3 months. So it can be flexible in that way. That's a little bit challenging potentially for like accounts payable and other more traditional funding systems to potentially handle. So good news about Dedoose at FSC, which is why we're holding these series of workshops, is that me and my department sort of already shepherded it through the IT approval process. So it's approved to be used at FSC already through IT. It's already listed as a vendor with purchasing because Jamie and I were able to get some money from our department towards our accounts. The challenges, though, even though it's gone through all those approval processes, are because the purchasing is a little bit more complicated. It might be a challenge to get it through accounts payable, to get it through purchasing. How we handled that is we requested, you can ask for a certain amount of money, say $100, $200, whatever that amount might be. And that will just sit in your Dedoose account, and it'll just pull from that each month based on your usage. So it'll either pull that $17.95, that $32, whatever it is based on your usage, until you zero out. And so if you are requesting money from your department, if you get a grant, whatever that may look like, the processes are just a little bit more complicated potentially to get it paid for. But they have a purchasing number, they have like a vendor number, they have all that on the back end. So if you or a department are interested in processing this, we can connect you to our wonderful department admin who can help kind of shepherd you through that process of what we put on our invoices to get that paid for. So we've done hopefully a little bit of the legwork to make it a little bit easier for other folks who are interested in using it in the future. All right, pros and cons, Jamie.
So pros and cons. So I personally have always liked Dedoose mostly because of these pros, right? So yes, it's great for collaboration, including across institutions, because it is stored in the cloud. That's why the collaboration works, because it's not all saved onto one physical computer. So it goes with you when you change computers, even if you change institutions and leave Farmingdale at some point, likely you will be able to take the stuff with you. So it's also good because it's very intuitive. So a lot of software systems, if you've used them, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, you likely have experienced that, a coder designed this. So it feels like it's more useful if you've had computer coding training. But this is very much designed with users in mind. It's very intuitive where things are, which means it's both good for early faculty that are just learning to use the system, but also very good for students to learn how to use, because you don't have to train them to be IT tech specialists to access it. I've already mentioned that it's cloud-based across several devices. And yes, there's a wide range of data options, and I feel like it's growing all the time. Like there's things on there that I don't even know yet that I'm interested to learn more about. So I think they're constantly expanding its applications. As Natalie's mentioned, one of the cons is the pricing structure may be a challenge if your funding is tied to an annual, because the funding's not tied to an annual, pricing structure may be a challenge for funding because we're used to often most of these fees are annual, right? So the way Dedoose works is paid monthly. And if you don't pay it, it disappears. So that's different than a lot of funding packages, which means it's not aligned, as we've already pointed out, with funding processes at many institutions. And yes, you can't access data without an account. So if you're working with students and need to get an account, make an account, so you do have to go through that process. And yes, it is more expensive if you have multiple collaborators or RAs.
I want to say I'm personally trained, I think 6 undergraduates and 2 master's level students to use Dedoose, and they picked it up very quickly. So I really like it for working with students. All right, so now I just want to show you some screenshots from, we'll start off with screenshots from our different data sets. So this is an example of one of the types of data output that Dedoose can generate. So this is a code cloud where it's taking the code book. This is from my project on The Biggest Loser, where I was analyzing episodes of the television show. And you can see it's sort of taking all of my code book, which this can be a nice visual for presentations, publications, but you can see on the left side, there's a ton of different code charts. It can look at, crossing descriptors and codes. You can do some of those code weight statistics and frequencies if you've added code weights. I've never done that on a project because I didn't have a lot of quantitative data to do that. But it can do a bunch of interesting things. And you can see down at the bottom in terms of mixed methods, if you have a lot of descriptors in there, it can even do basic statistical things like t-tests and ANOVAs if you're doing kind of more intensive mixed methods research. So that's nice. This is an example from my Biggest Loser data set. This is not a interview, it's a transcript from a television episode, but it essentially looks like an interview, and you'll see, I think, some examples from Jaime's interview as well. But you can see here, so the excerpts are the different colors that are selected. And then, so each excerpt is given a different color, so it's kind of easy to see where your different excerpts are. And then we can't see this in real time, but if you hover over the bars on the left, it'll show you what codes have been applied to that excerpt. That's just kind of what the interview looks like in real time. In my current project, I also have visual data. So my participants drew body maps, and you code visual data. I use the same code book as my interviews, and we created a set of codes for the body maps. But essentially, the selection process is quite similar. Instead of selecting text, you can just select a whole or parts of an image. So you can see here all these different boxes are different parts of the image that we've selected and then applied codes to. In this case, we were coding for things like what colors were used, what types of images were used. So that's how you can code images in Dedoose. And here's Jaime's data.
Yeah, and you can see my coding strategy is a little bit different, which is, I think, also a great thing about this modality is like you can very much adapt it to what you need it for. So my codes are often a little bit more complex because they have so many child codes and regular codes, and I often have used Dedoose primarily for like what's often called in qualitative research grounded theory, which is building concepts from the bottom up. But what I have here is an excerpt from my LGBTQ bar project where I was interviewing individuals about their experiences with straight people in LGBTQ social spaces. And you can see there's some redacted bits because this was the raw data, which meant some of it was a little confidential. But as you can see, much with Natalie's, what I would do is I would identify, oh, that's an interesting bit that applies to a particular code. I'm going to highlight that. And then you can add a central code. You can add child codes if you want to clarify what's going on here. So in this excerpt, for example, this one in green is all about how straights were experienced in a bar called Ambiance. What kinds of straight people were there? Mostly women with their gay male friends, women with their boyfriends, women avoiding the male gaze, and what kinds of straight people were in other bars. And I can kind of code those excerpts as the case may be. I also want to show you very briefly that you can also go back and forth and look at excerpts in different ways. So in your excerpt tab, you can go to all of your excerpts you've sampled out from, say, your interviews or your data. And you can also kind of visualize them this way by hovering over the excerpt, mixing like, oh, so if you're looking for quotes, for example, in a paper, and you're like, I really want something that's great for really highlighting, in this case, how straight people acted in Ambiance, I can go to this excerpt and there's a lovely quote there.
Yeah, you can also do keyword searching at the top. So you can see there's like a search bar. So if you're looking for a particular term or concept, you can also search the excerpts or the transcripts that way.
Yes, and I mentioned I thought there was a descriptor slide. There is. I was correct. Yay, we were planning ahead. So yes, you can also go back once you have more excerpts and once you've applied your descriptors, you can look at the entirety of your data set and maybe see, were there differences on these descriptors that were potentially relevant? So what I have here basically was ambivalence about the bar scene. amongst my LBGT respondents. So if I wanted to find out, for example, does sex and gender impact whether people are ambivalent about the bar scene in my sample, I can look at that here to see if there's meaningful differences. I can look to see if region matters for that. I can look at a variety of descriptors. And yeah, so there's ways to visualize that data, multiple ways to do it. And also, just really quickly, I mentioned that you can write memos. So if you have a thought while you're going through your data, you can just pop in a memo and compose it right in the system. I haven't personally used this modality a lot. I've often still used Word documents for those kinds of things, but that is an option for you in Dedoose.
Yeah, I've used a mix. I would say for my dissertation project, which is also in my Dedoose account, I definitely use memoing more often. One nice thing about memoing in Dedoose is that you can link several excerpts under the same memo. So it'll bring in like the different quotes. You can start to link them together. And if you're a person who likes to organize things more digitally, it can be a great way to start to build up your themes via memoing by linking excerpts together. So you're not having to like hunt for new quotes each time. But I also currently do more of a mix of like writing it out, memoing in a Word document, pasting in quotes, versus using it in Dedoose. I don't really know why I ended up that way. Maybe habit. But yeah.
And so just very briefly, I won't spend a lot of time on this because I feel like a lot of the same logic applies to content analysis, but just to give you some visualization of what that might look like. One of my current projects that I'm working on, I'm in the very early stages of data collection for this project, is looking at attitudes towards police in Pride. And so I've developed a code book. So I'm looking at status of police bans in a variety of Pride organizations across North America. To what extent there was resistance to these bans, what forms did that resistance take, what were the frames, positive and negative, that were brought up about those bans. And so I collected news articles and web pages with the help of some student research assistants. And here's just an example of uploading one of those first articles. And as you can see, I've highlighted the title there, which says permit revoked for Aurora Pride Parade after police departure, says too few officers were secured to maintain safety. And I've identified, well, this is an example of a state that is threatening to cancel an event because of the police ban. Just one more slide, I think, about this project.
And these were just for my own curiosity. With these, you've like, these are just like digital news articles that you saved as a PDF and then uploaded them. Nice.
And again, this is another thing maybe that's good to bring up. One of the things that's helpful when you're thinking about Dedoose is being very intentional about how you upload data. So in this case, I'm kind of treating these news articles as though they're like a sample of a news article, but you also might want to put all of your regions in one PDF and code that PDF and compare it. But it all depends on what you want to do with your data analysis. But there's options for that. But yeah, and so here's more of the article. So you don't have to just code titles. You can code the rest of the article too, as it turns out. So yeah, and here I pulled out a bit here where the Aurora Pride Parade has been mired in controversy involving the police department for a separate reason. Organizers of the parade made the decision last month that law enforcement officers may participate, but without weapons or individual vehicles. So there is the policy outlined, so I can code that. And so what I can go do once I've coded lots of these news articles is then compare how different regions, maybe I make a descriptor for cities. And I'm like, okay, so what are the different policies these cities had? What are the different state responses that these cities have had? And so on and so forth.
All right, so those are the basics. In the spring, we are also hosting in February a more in-depth kind of hands-on workshop. So we're going to be in the faculty center with all those computers, and we're going to have folks, either sign up for Dedoose does do that free trial. So we'll probably have folks sign up for a free trial to be able to actually, and Dedoose comes with a sample data set. So in terms of like kind of learning how it works, we're going to use some of those sample data sets for people to practice like creating a code and creating an excerpt and coding it, and maybe adding some descriptors and doing some of those basic tasks to get a more hands-on experience to see if Dedoose might be a good fit for some of your research. So please come to that. And we had a whole bunch of Q&A. Danielle, do you have any questions for us?
I do. I have two. I saw that part of the subscription includes the self-service user center. How are their support materials when you're trying to learn the features?
Yeah, absolutely. Dedoose has a very like a really good amount of documentation um, on their website that's free for anybody to access. Their help desk is pretty responsive and has been helpful with navigating technical issues and pricing and a bunch of different things. They also have their own set of explanatory videos on how to use different elements of it. So their documentation is pretty decent in terms of support.
And my other question, I don't know if this applies, but I wonder if at any point using Deduce, you decided you wanted to change the code or maybe the scope of the code. And I was wondering, did you just note it with a memo or does it have like a versioning feature that lets you know, like at some point you change this code during the process, whether it was the actual name of it or the definition of what was encompassed by that code?
Good question.
I don't think so. But I could be wrong.
I know you can see, so like when I've had research assistants working on it with me, you can see who applied what codes. So you can see, this user applied XYZ code. This was the last user to access the document. I haven't investigated the sort of like different versions piece. I do know that Deduce has that feature where you can do, if you want to do an explicit statistical test for coder reliability, and it has an option for you, like basically it won't show your codes to anyone else, and you sort of code the transcript individually, and it won't show the codes to the other person until the test is done, and then it'll match up your percentage of matching of the codes, which sometimes mixed methods or other kinds of journals want that information about coder reliability if there was more than one person coding. So I imagine if they have that feature, there is probably something like checking different versions to see what was updated or changed. But what I don't know is if you can like revert back to a previous version if somebody has changed it. That I'm not sure. I would have to look that up in the help.
I think like if you just edit the code, my understanding is it changes like wherever that code is.
Yeah.
It's like, so it's not like if you change the code, you have the old code on some of your own media. So like, for example, like if I change the title from, let's just be really random and not super meaningful. Like say I just changed a code from straight presence in ambiance to heterosexual presence in ambiance. Like if I were to do that, as soon as I change it to heterosexual, it would change it in all the codes. I've applied that code. So like if I wanted a new theme, I'd need to create a new code, but you also don't have to go back and redo your data if you find like I don't feel like this code is really representing it anymore. But I think like the last thing I'd say about that is I think with many things you have to be really reflexive about what you want to use the code book for. So I think like for open coding, when you're doing the first run at your data, we were trying to develop themes and concepts, there's often a lot of revision and expansion that happens as that goes. But if you're doing much more rigorous quantitative metrics where you're like, this is what I'm looking for, exactly these themes, exactly these codes, consistency probably matters a lot more. And you'd want to be very careful about changing your codes.
Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. And it was really interesting to learn that the memoing function allows you to link to specific excerpts in your content file. So that was really cool. So this way you can see exactly what you were talking about at that time. Yeah. And it does sound very user-friendly. So I am very excited for us to be hosting this follow-up workshop in February. I will make sure that I pop a link in the description when we post the video so that we, make sure everybody has a chance to register. But other than that, any final thoughts about Dedoose? Anything you wish you would have known, like, prior to going in to Dedoose?
I mean, if I had to say one bit of reservation about Dedoose, and it's not really a reservation so much as I feel like I was very drawn to Dedoose as an early career qualitative scholar, very much because of its surface level low cost, right? So like when you're dealing with software packages, particularly if you don't have funding for software packages, I mean, they are much more expensive to buy a yearly, say like Atlas TI license. And so like when you're a poor grad student living on ramen noodles, right? Like that's a lot, so you're like, oh, that sounds much better. Let's pay monthly this small number. But much as with streaming service subscriptions, oftentimes that adds up like over time. And so would it have possibly been cheaper to get one of the more expensive databases? Maybe.
Yeah.
But once you've kind of got it in Dedoose, you're kind of incentivized to keep it in Dedoose, at least till the termination of your project. So I guess if I had one bit of caution, just be aware of kind of the longevity of your data and whether what might seem like a financially feasible option for you now is going to be, if this is going to be a years long, project that you're going to have to keep. But the other side of that is if you're going to go away from the project for a bit, you can just not pay your Dedoose and you don't have to worry about losing your data. I've lapsed my Dedoose payment multiple times throughout the course of since grad school, and I've never lost any data from that.
Yeah. And as somebody who has used Dedoose now across 3 different institutions, I think the portability across institutions is, for me, one of the biggest perks. As I said, it has everything from my dissertation all the way back from like 2013 till my work from today. So that's been really great. I would say I learned the hard way about when you're using images to make sure to upload them as image files and not PDFs, in terms of like how it is to code. And be very, very careful if you're deleting data in Dedoose, because once you delete it, there's no trash folder. You have to pay Dedoose to recoup the files if you've lost them. And I also learned that the hard way, because I thought I was deleting duplicates of files, and instead I deleted many more things than I intended to that were already coded. So you do have to be careful because it is cloud-based. But it reminds you, it asks you multiple times, and I also now sort of routinely every 6 months or every year you can download a copy of your coded or like whatever your analyzed data, and it will download copies of everything for you. So now I do that more routinely so that I have hard copies outside of Dedoose of my coded data as well.
Another thing that I thought about, because I thought about that when you brought up adding the images, particularly if you outsource, like if you do interviews and you outsource any transcription, some of the transcription services use these weird templates that Dedoose does not like. So like when I hand transcribed like my interviews, they uploaded just fine, like to Dedoose. But some of my PDFs of my ones that were like outsourced, transcriptions from like transcription companies, were kind of chaotic and across like multiple pages, and you couldn't just scroll down. You have to constantly hit next. Yeah. So maybe like do a run if you outsource any transcription, like do a run of uploading it to Dedoose when you just have one, to be like, is this sustainable? Is there a way I can edit this data before you upload all of them and it's less usable than you'd like it to be? Yeah.
Those are all very good tips. Well, thank you so much. We are very much looking forward to the next session, and we will see everybody in February. Take care. Have a great day.
Bye.